From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
After 3 weeks of paralysis without a Speaker of the House, Republicans finally settle on a consensus choice, Congressman Mike Johnson of Louisiana. But will Speaker Johnson get any more leeway to govern than his predecessor did? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. It has been 22 days since the ouster of Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and now Republicans have gone through 4 choices, or 5 if you include McCarthy. First, it was McCarthy's number 2, Steve Scalise. Then it was Congressman Jim Jordan, then Tom Emmer, who withdrew before even getting a vote on the floor when opposition arose. And now we have a final speaker. It is Mike Johnson of Louisiana. Here he is in an address last night.
Democracy is messy sometimes, but it is our system. This conference that you see, this House Republican majority is united. I'm honored to have the support of my colleagues, and what they understand about this is servant leadership. We're going to serve the people of this country. We're going to restore their faith in this Congress, this institution of government.
And here is Elise Stefanik nominating him on the floor for Speaker of the House.
A deeply respected constitutional lawyer, Mike has dedicated his life to preserving America's great principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mike is a titan on the Judiciary Committee and a dedicated member of the House Armed Services Committee. And as vice chair of our conference, he has united all of our members to speak clearly and boldly on behalf of the American people. A friend to all and an enemy to none, Mike is strong, tough, and fair. And above all, Mike is kind.
I'm not sure about a friend to all, but apparently an enemy to none, Kim. The vote on the floor for Mike Johnson was all 220 Republicans in favor. And I don't know how much of that was just exhaustion from these Republicans after these repeated failures to pick a nominee. But Kim, from your perspective, what do we know about Mike Johnson, who is not a national public figure or hasn't been up till now, to my eye, and how do we expect him to govern the House?
Kyle, I actually think the enemy to none really was the deciding factor in here. And the way I would think of Mike Johnson and this win for the speakership is that he was the right guy at the right time. Obviously, we've been through a number of other names, and what you had seen going on was this fight between the right and the more center of the caucus, grinding their feet and digging in against different names that had come up. Here's what we know about Mike Johnson and why he won this vote. First of all, he's very well known within the caucus, even if he may not be as national a figure as you note. He's vice chairman of the Republican conference. He also serves as deputy whip, so he's familiar with all the members. Adding to this was the fact that he previously was the head of the Republican Study Committee, which is the largest caucus in the House. It has about 170 members, also viewed as right of center group within the House, and so very well known among everybody there. He certainly made everyone on the right feel good about his candidacy. He is a constitutional lawyer. He's known as being very principled. He actually supported Jim Jordan's bid for the speakership. The two of them are quite close. That certainly won him some praise by those on the right who were very much in favor of Jim Jordan's candidacy. At the same time, though, he's less public facing than a guy like Jordan. So I think he's sort of in the same place on many views, but he's not as much as a firebrand. I think that certainly calmed and made more confident a lot of those members who come from Biden districts. They didn't feel as though a vote for Johnson would hurt them as much coming into the next election. Also, what really helped him, he's from Louisiana, and that's where Steve Scalise is from. And Steve Scalise was a big supporter of this. Unlike Jordan, Steve Scalise came out last night with a statement, said, "I am proud to support my dear friend, Mike Johnson." for the position of Speaker, calling him an honest, hardworking, and principled person. I think that really gave the green light to all of the people who'd been very angry on Steve Scalise's behalf that he had not been elected. So all of those votes were there. And then one more thing I'll just say about Mike Johnson, which I find myself kind of fascinating. This guy is a straight up policy wonk. He is someone that really digs into the issues, understands everything from the financial side to the legal side. As Elise Stefanik noted there, he leads a subcommittee on the Judiciary Committee. He's been central to a lot of the investigations going into the weaponization of the federal government, the Biden family issues with Hunter Biden. But this guy is probably the biggest policy wonk we've had as a speaker since Paul Ryan. So a lot of this is still going to come down to his ability to manage, but he's got all the right credentials, and he does, at least for the moment, I would note, have far more unanimity around his speakership than even Kevin McCarthy did, far more than Kevin McCarthy did when he finally won those 15 ugly votes back in January to become speaker.
It probably won't take long to find out how Speaker Johnson is doing this active management, this balancing act, because the first thing that is going to be on his plate is funding of the federal government. And as a reminder, Kevin McCarthy was trying to make the argument that Republicans had nothing to gain from a government shutdown last month. And in extremis, he finally resorted to passing a 45-day spending extension with an assist from Democratic votes. That was the excuse that was cited by the mutineers who then ousted him from his speakership. But now we are facing a funding deadline, Kate, of November 17th. And according to the Congressional Research Service, the House has only passed, I believe, 4 of the 12 normal appropriations bills. And so now we are sitting here 3 weeks from a government deadline again. And if Speaker Johnson is going to avoid a government shutdown in a divided government with a Senate controlled by Democrats, there are going to have to be negotiations and deals cut. And I guess the optimistic case for his speakership is that, in the same sense that only Nixon could go to China, they say, maybe only a speaker like Mr. Johnson, in contrast to Kevin McCarthy, can take a sort of ugly spending deal with some victories for conservatives, but not all they want, and sell it to this narrow House majority and get people like the Freedom Caucus to vote for it.
Right. I agree with Kim's points that Johnson does have some cross-cultural fluency with the different factions of the GOP. The Republican Study Committee before the Freedom Caucus was really the heart of conservative policy on the House side of the Hill. So he brings that credibility to his speakership. And he's also been valuable on armed services, for instance, and has moved some bills, for instance, on protecting the homeland from drones. Maybe that's not the biographical color our listeners are looking for, but it speaks to his credentials as a policy wonk like Kim was talking about. But I would note perhaps it is a little premature for some of the triumphalism that we're seeing, that Republicans are so relieved that this 3-week spectacle is behind them, that perhaps we are underestimating the real size of the challenge that awaits between now and November 17th, when the government runs out of funding. I will say Johnson was passing around this letter to his colleagues. I kind of talked about his thinking about that process, and he was doing that earlier this week. He was saying that Republicans need to get some leverage by passing more appropriations bills. I would remind you, Kevin McCarthy was also making that argument, and it seems like a logical one, given that they have a thin majority and don't control the Senate or the White House. So he was suggesting going one by one down these appropriations bills: energy and water on the week of October 23rd, interior and environment on the week of the 30th, and talking about how the House can gain leverage by getting those done. He also said he wanted to avoid a Christmas omnibus where you do all the spending bills at once and try to jam it down everyone's throat, and that he was willing to accept perhaps a temporary measure, another continuing resolution that expired in either January or April. I would note there are still some question marks. I do think it's good news that he is, one, focusing on governing. He mentions that multiple times in his letter, and also on expanding the Republican majority. So it's not merely a mood speakership. He sees what the real goals of the conference should be. But I do note some other question marks that I still have. He says in his letter that he wants to pass a resolution condemning Hamas, which is welcome, but is not the same as making sure Israel never runs low on precision bombs or interceptors for their air defenses. And I guess that my larger point then is we're still a question mark on exactly how the House would handle the president's request for more money for Israel, Ukraine, and also for the Pacific. That is a big question mark and something that I think Republicans really need to do. And it is questionable to me to mention that the priority in December would be the Farm Bill, which to my eye, any conservative credential should be less focused on than core issues of national defense during an international crisis. But I think there are some really promising signs here. Like I said, that he does know that the question that Republicans have now is whether they can govern, and that's the task. His speakership will be measured in the results of that over the next few weeks.
Kim, what's your read of this question on the coming spending argument? Because the challenge, it seems to me, is there were people last month when Speaker McCarthy was trying to get the government funded who were out and out making the argument that Republicans should shut down the government, that would be a good thing to do. They could win that political battle. And I think they are not correct about that. But if they thought that way last month, I don't know why they would feel any differently next month when Speaker Johnson is going to be making the same sort of arguments.
One thing I would say is that they can't be surprised that this is what he does. As Kate noted, he was very clear in the letter that he spent around 2 days ago. He says if another stopgap measure is needed to extend government funding beyond that November 17th deadline, he said he would propose another one that went through January or even to April. Now, he also made clear that that was dependent on people following this schedule that he had laid out to get that leverage and pass as many bills as possible. Here's something that I think is going to work in his favor in maybe keeping those guys on board. He did seem to understand the things that really worry them. He specifically noted, as Kate pointed out, that he has no interest in letting the Senate jam the House with a Christmas omnibus. That's something that has really bothered people on the right. They were very skeptical of Kevin McCarthy, rightly or wrongly. I think that was wrong. I think he was on the same page. But they were very worried that there was no urgency to getting these bills done and that we would end up with another omnibus and blowout spending, which would essentially demolish all the work Republicans had put in so far to trying to cut spending back to pre-COVID levels. So there's that. But he also was reassuring them as to the road forward for the following year. And this is something that they've been really worried about too. He said that he wanted to devote January through April to getting out a budget resolution and passing it as a conference with consensus. And then he said, we're going to get all of our spending bills done by July. And he specifically noted in this thing, we are not going to break for district work until all 12 appropriations bills have passed the House. I know these seem like small things, but for whatever reason, even as Republicans on the right of the conference gave their vote to McCarthy at the end, they simply did not trust him. And I think one thing that is a little different is that Johnson does come in with a high level of trust, just given the side of the conference he comes from and his very good relations with a lot of people in, for instance, the House Freedom Caucus. So that doesn't mean that there aren't still going to be enormous divisions and debates and fights, because one of the reasons these bills haven't moved forward more quickly is because Republicans have been fighting over the provisions that are in them and using these expansive new powers they have on the floor and in committees to stymie them and keep things from flowing. He's going to have to figure out a way to do consensus. But I think, Kyle, I really do believe that at least some of the gripes you saw from those on the right about continuing resolutions or McCarthy's debt ceiling deal in the end were a lot more wrapped up in their frustration with the fact that Kevin McCarthy ever became speaker than they were necessarily in the policy that was going forward, just because that was exhibited pretty well by the fact that they kept changing their minds as to why they were arguing against this, because they didn't really have a point about the policy. This was much more wrapped up in personalities.